Welcome to The Way We Work, 5 micro talks breaking down the science of work culture in the game industry. What works, what definitely doesn't, and more importantly, how all of us can remake it. The goal here is to shift leaders from conversation to action. We want you to leave armed with the knowledge to enact practical solutions, the empathy to consider people-first culture, and the will to bet on long-term human sustainability in our industry. So if you may have surmised, we're not going to waste your time trying to convince you that things need to change in our industry. From layoffs to burnout to abuse and more, the average shelf life of a game developer is only 3 to 7 years, less than a decade. We're seeing the burnout of entire micro-generations of developers. So for the purposes of today, consider the need to change as an accepted premise, settled science. What we're instead going to focus on is what to change and most importantly, how to change. Because now that we see the problem, the next step is solving it. So let's meet our speakers. We're going to start off with Lisette Teacher Montgomery. She'll be speaking on the front of the pipeline and hiring standards. Dr. J.C. Lau will be speaking on developing from IC to leadership. I will be speaking on building or rebuilding healthy work culture. Latoya Peterson, on my left, will be speaking on funding, and Eka will be speaking on how to put this all together in your indie studio. Now, let's hear from Lisette.
Welcome, everyone. It's clear by the turnout that we've all really believe that this is important at this critical time in our industry. So I think it speaks to all of us that we are here because we want to see a change. I'll do a quick intro. My name is Lisette Teacher Montgomery. I've been making games for over 23 years. I've shipped 15 titles, won several awards and nominations for Game of the Year for Psychonauts, South Park, Sims, and Transformers. So some of the things I'm talking about today are a reflection of my 23 years of experience as an art director, but also is my 10 years experience on the board developing Game Heads, a local, well, now an online worldwide accelerator. So the first area we want to focus on is talent development and retention. That's what my talk is going to be focused on, and we'll be focusing on curriculum standardization, entry-level requirements, hiring challenges, and success stories we found through Game Heads tackling some of these issues. Talent development and retention has never been more challenging for all roles, but especially in technical roles and programming. My talk will cover my experience as an art director, a founding member of Game Heads, and someone who has worked diligently to make the future of games more accessible to all. So let's start with game schools. Game schools are, quite frankly, simply undertraining the next generation of devs. Most schools don't set people up for success, and even if you do go to a notable school, there's no guarantee that you will be ready to work day one. I attribute this to 2 main factors: poor teacher hiring and salaries, and secondly, dev process knowledge. Most game school teachers are underpaid. For example, when I was working as a teacher at Expressions, I was getting $50 an hour and only part-time. Now, if you compare that to the salaried or hourly game pay you get at most studios, you're already getting underpaid just trying to work part-time. That creates a situation where most teachers have little to no in-studio or product development experience. And the side effect of that is that now tools are mostly taught and not the process of actual game development. Programming and development processes need standardization and fundamental curriculum driven by industry experts with recent game dev experience. Primarily driven by on-site project learning with teams. You should be making games in school. I can't really understate how important this is. You can't really understand how games are actually made without building at least one yourself and several before you graduate. Adding to this is that most employers do not provide entry-level training of any sort. So you literally have to learn all of this on your own if you're not getting it from your university degree and programs. One of the solutions that I found to be successful is when students spend their extra time, the little they do have, going to game jams like Melanated Kitchen, Global Game Jam, and several others. You can see the link here of some options. So if you don't have the necessarily support you're getting from your university program, you can reach out to game jams and participate in them to get the experience you need in actually development. Next challenge, entry-level requirements. Quite frankly, they're insane. 3 years minimum is not a realistic entry-level requirement. Employers are better served looking for students with demonstrable capacity. Games they've created, in-game apps that they've made work on their own, proven that they're able to work. One of the side effects of this is outsourcing. Outsourcing began in earnest in 2004 after the EA spouse lawsuit. And here we are 20 years later, and the effects are hitting the industry very hard. We've seen major burnout of our mid-level talent and a lot of our senior talent, so most devs quit between 3 to 5 or 7 years. This has led to mid and junior devs without proper mentorship or support, who then burn out. Adding to that, outsourcing artists are also underpaid, overworked, and rarely get to work in engine, or are part of a dev team and understand what processes are. A lot of our new and entry-level talent are just not learning the whole product development pipeline. This has created a limited experience talent pool and a lack of technical expertise. And this has had a very total negative impact on Black, Brown, and femme game developers. It has quite frankly been devastating. The numbers have not moved despite all the optics and the PR. When I started in the industry, Black game devs represented 4% of the industry, and now we are anywhere between 1% and 3%, depending on what stat you look at. The industry has grown, but not along with us. We, Black females, are less than a fraction of 1% of the industry. The next challenge is hiring and talent development. Quite frankly, more internship and mentorship programs with studios are needed. Ideally, partnering with nonprofit schools and accelerators, along with game studios to help build long-term pathway programs like Game Heads are the solution. The other opportunities that we can provide are internships. They provide valuable on-the-ground training and expose entry-level talent to current dev processes. On the flip side, unpaid internships are extremely elitist and, quite frankly, illegal. Very few people are independently wealthy enough to work for free. Please, people need to pay their bills. This whole model is unsustainable. Please do not take an unpaid internship. Instead, look for pathway programs like Game Heads and pathway programs at schools like Carnegie Mellon and university programs that actually work alongside studios to develop pipelines. At Game Heads, we work with industry professionals in creating our curriculum, teaching up-to-date skills, and to build relationships for their internship opportunities. And finally, we'll have a lighter note, and that is our success stories with Game Heads. The purpose of Game Heads is that we paper over the cracks for our students, so they have a supported pathway to careers in games and tech. We don't replace a four-year university, we are a complement to them by providing standard industry training and game development support and internships. Our students are paired with mentors, and they are training alongside of them as they develop their games throughout the years, and especially during our summer intensive program. This continued relationship and recurring game development experience year over year has helped our students create portfolios and resumes that show demonstrable capacity to potential employers. They help us build valuable connections with studios like Sony, for example. Last month, we released a skin pack that actually benefits Game Heads 100%, and our students work directly with Insomniac to develop the skins, and in turn, that has given them practical dev experience and their first shipping credit. So these are the type of programs that we feel can help bridge the gap and help fuse the public and private sector in order to improve our talent pipelines. And with that, I will hand it over to the talented Dr. J.C. Lau.
Hello. I'm standing on a box. This is great. I'm 4 foot, my ass is 4'11", so yeah. Anyways, hello, I am Dr. J.C. Lau. I am a producer at Probably Monsters. And I've been in the games industry for about 8 years now, so I think I'm the baby on this panel. But here's a bit about me. So here are some of the studios I've worked at and some of the leadership accelerators that I've been part of. But before I got into games at all, I was a college professor. My areas of expertise was political philosophy, and I spent a lot of time studying power structures and collective decision-making processes. So for today's talk, I'm going to take some of my learnings from that past life and apply it to the way we work. Now, I don't need to tell you that a lot of things suck really hard for a lot of people right now, but when toxic workplace practices or cold business decisions drive people out of this industry, this is a loss for us all. Like, functional teams are broken up, and for the survivors, we have to reinvent wheels, train up new people, and often we're doing this against existing timelines, which effectively means you're more behind than you were before because you had to redo work, and that sucks. So far, we've heard Lizette talk about strategies for getting diverse talent into the industry, but what do you do when they're here? I'm currently moving into leadership roles, and sometimes it's really hard to look at this industry and think, this is what I'm inheriting? Like, what? How can I help my reports feel confident about their career choices and their work? Like, how can we all feel confident about our career choices? How can we collectively transform this industry's future into something safe and sustainable? It's really easy to despair at the scale of the problem. But while you cannot fix the entire industry, you can make a difference in the space where you have the most impact. That is the space that is immediately around you. And I think the way to do this is to intentionally and proactively grow and become better leaders who can support a better culture. So think back on your careers. Are there people who you thought were like, yeah, I would love to work with that person again? You know, people that were like good communicators and collaborators and people who were just able to work with all kinds of personalities. What did those people have in common? Fundamentally, those are people who have built connections and empathy and psychological safety with their peers. And as leaders, we should want to be those people, and we should also want to grow those people. So I think there are 3 ways that this applies. Firstly, we do this through collective action, so we all do our part to grow people in our teams. Secondly, we do this through leadership that is informed by soft power. That is, we lead through empathy and co-opting. And finally, we do this through incremental progress. That is, we work on getting better every day. So let's talk about collective action first. You may have heard of a little game called Helldivers 2. As a single Helldiver, you can't win the galactic war by yourself, but if enough other Helldivers all did their individual missions and you all like brought democracy to your regions, you can solve this sector by sector, and that's how you win the war. It has a larger effect than what any individual can achieve. So this is actually an example of a collective action to solve a problem. Other examples might be things like, we all collectively follow driving laws, things like boycotts. Unionization is a collective action. Coming together for a conference is a collective action. These are actions that require coordination and working together. And the idea here is I can support my reports and my team, and you can support your reports and your team. And if we all do this, and there's enough of us doing this in our own little spheres of influence, we might collectively make the industry a little bit better. So keep that in mind. Let's look at leadership informed by soft power. Now, what do I mean by soft power? Normally, when we talk about power, we talk about hard leadership power. That is, you have the coercive power of your title or role to drive change. Organizational structures are just, by definition, structures of hard power. Like, you've got hierarchy, you have directors, you have managers, and so on. And hard power is often imposed by people who have it on people who don't. And in a lot of these cases, saying things like, well, do this because I say so, is like an acceptable justification to do something. But by contrast, soft power appeals to your values or culture to drive change rather than rigid authority. So it's the ability to co-opt rather than coerce. And this is what you do as peers, or like, when you manage upwards, like when you talk to your managers. Soft power actually allows for the democratization of your company culture because it is what everyone experiences. Like, it's how you treat each other, regardless of what your org structure is or where you are in your company hierarchy. So if you're a leader, you have both, and you might see soft power as a threat to your hard power, but I argue that soft power necessarily coexists with hard power. Because remember, before you had hard power, you had soft power. And by its very nature, even in the largest organizations with the hardest hierarchical power, your entire operation would just fall apart if you didn't have people feeling empowered to influence each other and do their work. So as an example, if you're in a meeting and everyone has the same title and the same level of experience, that is, you will have the same hard power, you still need to make decisions through soft power and influence. And finally, soft power isn't a limited resource. There's plenty to go around, and giving some to others doesn't actually take away from your hard power. So soft power and hard power are therefore both tools you can use in different situations. And if you have both, which one you use will impact how open, safe, and engaged your team is, that is, your culture. So as an example, in times of disruptive behavior, it's easier just to use your hard power to shut it down. Like if you're a leader, you can just come in and say, stop it. But does that really bring about the long-term change that you want? Doing that doesn't actually solve the underlying problem of why someone was behaving that way in the first place. So it might stop the behavior, but then they might also stop engaging and participating on your team. And then you've just lost a perspective from someone on your team, and you've become less psychologically safe. But instead, framing the behavior as an opportunity for a conversation helps to address the root cause of the issue. So you can say something like, why is this so important to you? I want to know so I can better understand, even if I don't agree. And this invites people to discuss and engage while acknowledging what their needs are. And then once you've understood what the underlying issue is, we can go and solve that. So here's an example of how we practice soft power. On my team, we have this weekly ritual called Open Forum. And once a week, we have this opt-in meeting where people can bring up any issues they want about like gameplay or culture or company policy. And Open Forum is one of the biggest cultural touchstones for our studio. We all come to the conversation as peers with soft power. And we have a director that facilitates it, but the vast majority of the conversation is driven by the team. We all hold space for each other, and it's really transparent. Like the most junior person on the team has the same voice or as much of a voice as someone who is more closely with leadership. It's technically an opt-in meeting, but we consistently have a 90% or higher attendance rate. And the goal of Open Forum isn't actually like agreement. The goal is engagement, because remember, soft power is about making change through co-opting and shared values. And this naturally puts guardrails around how you want to give feedback. So for example, if you're in a playtest and you didn't like how the character's jump ability felt, you can't just come to Open Forum and say, hey, jump sucks, because that's not effective for change when you say that to your peers. But if you trust that your peers are, skilled at what they do and they're experts and knowledgeable about their craft, you could try to understand why jump was implemented that way. So you might say something like, hey, jump didn't feel good to me. Like, why does the arc do this? Good designs and good culture need to be challenged to become great. So give your team the space and power to do exactly that. So when you can have open, honest, and psychologically safe conversations around your work and culture, it creates more effective teams by reducing the cognitive cost of interactions. So effective teams spend less time in deliberation, resolving process issues, or tripping over issues with communication. So at this point, you don't have to have a conversation to just have the conversation. And this might seem really granular, but it adds up in terms of project time and energy. So you can practice soft power and still get results, but because soft power relies on things like trust and bravery and psychological safety, it takes time and effort to foster through incremental and regular practice. So this is an idea that I am taking from James Clear's book, Atomic Habits. The idea here is you basically, if you want to win a marathon, you don't just win a marathon. You have to, get up and practice, and it takes time and forming habit. And this is similar to if you use Agile for constant improvement in your deliverables, take the same principle here and use it to improve your team. So much of this industry is focused on short-term goals. Like we get the next update out the door, we hire to meet scope, and then when we ship the game, we cut that team. And then the next time you need a bunch of people for a project, you have to rehire them and retrain them. And this is just really ineffective. So what I want to propose is that intentionally taking small amounts of time regularly to hold space for your team and encourage them to connect with each other this is a leadership skill you can develop in everyone, regardless of their title or role. And this makes everyone better across successive projects. So here is an interesting point from Clear's book. If you improve 1% every day over a course of a year, you end up 37 times better by the time you're done. And conversely, if you get 1% worse every day for a year, you go down to nearly 0. So what starts out as a small win or a minor setback actually accumulates into something much more. So think about what this could look like if we all work to improve our industry by improving the way that we lead. Like, as an example, Super Mario Brothers came out in 1985, and it was made by a team of 5 people. And this was, 39 years ago? Super Mario Wonder came out last year in 2023, and of those 5 original people that worked on Super Mario Brothers, 4 of them worked on Super Mario Wonder. So imagine what that level of collaboration could look like in our industry. And imagine what we could have if we could have that across the entire industry, and we could just say game development is a forever career. Think of how we could use all that institutional knowledge just to make our projects even better. So as a quick wrap-up, I hope I've shown you a lens by which you can look at sustainability by practicing soft power and empowering a team to do so. It creates a kinder, engaging, human-centered industry, which is one where we can create leaders and cultures that we can be proud of. Again, this is not a magical, one-size-fits-all solve, but by thinking about what you can do to positively impact the people around you and by leading with soft power, we can all do a small part in improving the way we work. Okay, I'm JC Lau. Thank you for listening. This is where you can find me on the internet. And next up is Sinead Bryant to talk about culture.
Thank you, JC. Changing the way we work requires changing hearts and minds from the IC level to the leadership level. We just heard from JC about soft power and incremental progress in the day-to-day. I'm here to talk about driving long-term culture change that is turning that day-to-day into the year-over-year. Let's talk about workplace culture and building sustainability into the business. I had an old manager once. He did not want to talk about culture. He wanted to talk about game mechanics. He wanted to talk about P&Ls and break-evens. He even wanted to talk about the art that we had hanging on the wall. But he did not want to talk about culture, didn't want to think about it. He always say, Sinead, all we have to do is hire the right people, and we'll get a good culture. And it's understandable, right? Like workplace culture, those are 2 of the most terrifying words that you can hear as a leader. Chances are, if someone's talking to you about culture, it's because something has already gone horribly, horribly wrong. And we've already seen the ways that workplace cultures can go wrong in recent years. I mean, we were already in the midst of a cultural earthquake, even before the studio consolidations and mass layoffs of the last year plus. Something's got to give. But good culture doesn't just happen. To build it, you have to talk about it. So today, we're going to talk about it. I'm going to challenge you to talk and think about your company's culture. And we're going to get proactive about fixing the culture problem that you probably know that you have. So my name is Sinead Bryant. I'm an executive producer over at Oculus Publishing. I've been in professional game development for more than 20 years. Here's some of the stuff I do, some of the stuff I've written, some of the games I've shipped. Over the years, I've worked at companies from Xbox and Take-Two to Capcom and Midway Home Entertainment, on projects with simply massive budgets to those with barely 2 rupees to rub together. I've seen how a lot of teams work and how a lot of companies run, and I'm excited to talk about the way we work. Now, when it comes to making a new culture or remaking an old one, I want you to keep 3 guiding principles in mind. Number 1, what do you value? Number 2, culture is not one size fits all. Number 3, values first hiring. More on those later. Now, I like to get interactive, so quick show of hands. Who here works at a company with less than 10 people? Anyone? Okay, we've got a few folks, all right. Now, who here works at a company with more than 10 people? That's what I thought. Okay, so the majority of folks, more than 10 people. Now, what if I told you that your first 10 hires decided your company's culture, your first 10? Now, let's break that down. Like, at a shiny new company, a bold statement about your first 10 hires can be a blueprint, something to keep in mind as you're developing hiring strategy. But what if you're not hiring your first 10? What if you've already hired them? What if you're hiring employee number 110 or number 1010? That bold statement feels more like another boulder that you're being asked to push up yet another hill. So, what do you do? Well, let's start talking about culture by first defining workplace culture. Now, to me, culture is the shared values, behaviors, and beliefs that you want your team to rally behind to achieve organizational goals. Now, there are many ways in which culture shows up in the workplace. It can encompass everything from who you hire to the balance between work and life, from the speed at which people get promoted to how many types of cereal you offer in your micro kitchen. It can be open door policies or open office floor plans. Put another way, culture is the name of the blanket that we throw over the mystery that creates the day-to-day experience your people have at work. And yes, that was me paraphrasing AC/DC in a GDC talk. Now I've described what culture is to me. Let's get back to you. How would someone describe the workplace culture at your company? Or actually, let me put that a different way. How would you want people to describe your culture? Do you want them to say it's empowering, that they feel respected, that the work they do is valued, that management cares about them as people and not just as human resources? Good cultures, healthy cultures like that don't just happen. They require deliberate decision and deliberate planning, and sometimes difficult conversations. Now, we've talked about the good. Let's talk about the not so good. Here's how the culture has been described at a few prominent places in the industry, and don't worry, names have been changed, so we all have jobs tomorrow. One studio was described as the poster child for poor work-life balance. Sorry, Travis Kelce. For another, I was advised that only 50% of the job is actually knowing how to do the job. The other 50%? Politics. Another still was described as a blank slate. But is it a good thing if no one knows who you are or what you stand for? Whether it's obsessed with heroics, hyper-competitive, or hierarchical, greedy, competitive, combative, cliquey, people will describe your company by how your culture made them feel. And their trust in you as competent leaders is directly proportional to how big of a gap there is between the truth and the brochure. So now, let's fix it. Let's talk about making or remaking a deliberate workplace culture. Number 1, what do you value? Remember our definition of culture, the shared values, behaviors, and beliefs, the blanket, the mystery? The key word in all that is shared. Culture picks up where the employee handbook leaves off, and a team will lean on a good set of shared values to direct them through the course of the many, many decisions that they make every day. Ask my team how often I used our difficult conversations value as a reminder that consensus and collaboration aren't always easy. So here's what I want you to do when you leave here today. Talk about it. Talk about your culture. Talk about your values to each other as leaders, but most importantly, to your peers, your directs, your teams. Don't just talk about it to HR, the DEI director, or the marginalized folks in your office who already have too much to do. A good rule of thumb for culture change: you should be talking about your culture and your values as much or more than you talk about the cool game that you're all making together, and certainly more than you talk about the wall art. Number 2, culture is not one size fits all. Even as an expression of shared values, people can experience work culture very differently. Consider the team value, work hard, play hard. That's an especially common one in the game industry. No idea why. But just as common is forgetting that there's no universal definition of play. If you don't believe me, let me tell you a tale of surprise Office Kittens Day. Quick show of hands. Who here loves kittens? All right. Yes, this is a kitten-friendly zone. Who here isn't a big fan of cats or kittens? Oh, there's a couple people. Okay, I'm talking to the kitten folks, though. So, like most people, like most game developers, I love kittens. So when my job decided they were going to surprise us all with a, hey, there's kittens over in the conference room you can play with all day, I should have been ecstatic, right? Well, one thing to know about me is I am also horribly allergic to cats. So while an Office Kitten Day sounds like a dream come true, a surprise Office Kitten Day just sort of with a whole lot of this. By the way, I do take daily meds for my allergies now, so if Zuck would like to surprise us with kittens, I would not complain. But shared values, different experiences. So here's what I want you to do when you leave today. Ask yourself, what are some of the ways our company culture might be experienced in different ways by different people? Ask why that is. And then lastly, ask what can we do about it? How can we make sure our culture is more deliberately inclusive? Oh, and speaking of inclusive, can we all agree to stop playing that team building guess the baby picture game? I always lose, and if you ask why, I'm gonna guess you've never been the only black woman on a team before. Lastly, number 3, values first hiring. In other words, hire for values first. And I know that this sounds backwards, but hear me out. Companies tend to hire for skills first and everything else after. But when you're building or rebuilding a culture, values are the skill that you most need. One mistake larger companies often make is trying to skip all the work by just hiring a single DEI director to be accountable for everything, to fix everything. And I don't even have to tell you, that doesn't work. Whether it's a culture you built or one that you inherited, it's not solely up to them to fix your culture problem. Leaders, it is up to you. Your next 10 hires can radically change your company culture. Done right, these culture carriers bring skills and value-based leadership and can aid in recalibrating, even resetting your culture. But you can't skip to the end. You can't skip the hard work. So here's what I want you to do when you leave here today. Take everything you've learned about your company values in number 1, and your team's consumption of those values in number 2, and then rethink who and how you would hire if your only job requirements were value-based. What would the job description look like? What would the candidate pool look like? I can imagine it would look very different from who you're courting right now. Remember, culture work is collective action in action. It takes an entire team working together, pushing the same direction to make or remake a culture. Our job as leaders is not merely to direct products, but to direct the people who make the products. And speaking of people, it has to be said, the way that you hire and the way that you fire are part of your culture too. To say this last year has been challenging is an understatement. 56% of surveyed devs are worried about upcoming layoffs. And with almost 18,000 game jobs gone in just the last 14 months, it's no surprise. People are struggling, and many leaders seem to think the solution is in figuring out how to have good layoffs or to fire perfectly, as a certain tech CEO just coined. But the truth is, you can't perfect trauma. And we're applauding ourselves while doing little to understand how to actually support our former and future colleagues. That's your culture too. Leaders, we can do better. We can do better today. We can support our former, current, and future colleagues by building cultures centered on psychological safety, empathetic management with the tools to weather even this instability. Now, I started my talk by saying your culture is decided in your first 10 hires. Let me end it by paraphrasing another popular phrase. Culture eats your studio strategy for breakfast. So be culture-minded. Rethinking the way we work is the way we win. Thank you very much. My name is Sinead Bryant. Here's how to find and follow me. And next up, let's hear from LaToya Peterson with Games Funding.
All right, hello, hello, good afternoon. So we've just heard 3 wonderful micro talks, and we have one coming up after me from the fabulous Eka. I wanted to take a quick moment to talk about something slightly different. We normally focus on what's happening internally at the workplace. But gaming is, for folks who don't know me, I'm LaToya Peterson, co-founder and CXO of Glow Up Games, one of the first all-women of color founded game studios. And gaming is my 3rd career. So first I was a writer, blogger, and radio host. Did a lot of those things, a little bit of TV hosting as well. And then I transitioned out of that and went into newsroom management, did news and then sports. Worked at Al Jazeera, Fusion, Univision, and ESPN and Disney. And then after that, my good friend Matu asked if I wanted to co-found a studio, and we started Glow Up Games back in 2019. And so I've been a leader and a manager and executive for about 10 years now. And there are some common threads that I started seeing industry over industry. And I have to admit, I'm struggling a little bit with this talk today because I presented the award for the Indie Developer Award to Zalavir Nelson at the Blacks in Gaming Awards. And he delivered. Have you guys seen that talk on Twitter? Please look up Zalavir's talk, where he exhorts this audience to not lay ourselves at the mercy of this industry that is going to take so much from us and give so little. As Shanae just pointed out, we've lost 18,000 game jobs. 18,000 people's lives were upended. 18,000 little points of institutional knowledge have been eliminated. So when I look at this issue, when I start thinking about what I've seen, what happened, what we were able to build at Glow Up, what we never had the money to properly do, we started thinking about, let's talk about the macro influences that influence your studio culture that are far outside of what's happening day to day. So there's an article in Mother Jones that I really love called The Smash and Grab Economy, and it talks a lot about the entrance of private equity and to what happens when we are looking at the ways in which funding models are designed to exploit, specifically to look at what they feel like is the most valuable piece, the IP, generally never the people, but we'll get to that in a second. But what's the most valuable piece of the corporation or the organization, strip that out, take it away from the people who helped build that, and then turn it into another commodity. And so as you think about that, and you think about the ways in which games funding is structured, you start seeing a lot of similarities. But I mentioned before, I came from another industry before this. I came from journalism. And a lot of journalism over the last 10 years was managing through downturns, managing layoffs, managing just the destruction over and over again. When I was at ESPN, I was there for 3 years, and there were 5 distinct rounds of layoffs. It's a really tough environment to be in. But I really resonated with Shanae's point that you can't perfect trauma. Up there on the screen is the Hollywood Reporter's reporting on one of the most traumatic days of my life as a manager, when I arrived to work and realized my entire team was laid off and no one had told us beforehand. So all of the talent I had nurtured, all the juniors, all the folks who had moved, had to break leases, all the things that happened, all the chaos, the executives at Al Jazeera at the time were planning to come down from New York to make the announcement, but they never made it. And so everyone was just sitting there, key cards not working, freaking out what was happening, finding out that of the team of 50, I was one of 9 left. And those kind of experiences change you. As Shanae pointed out, a layoff is not something that happens just on a balance sheet. It's not just numbers. It also impacts the people both who have to leave and those who stay. And so after that, I took my career as an executive a lot more seriously, figuring that if I was in charge of the P&Ls, if I was the one that could help figure out how to raise the money, if I was going to do this, I could do this differently, that people wouldn't have to suffer the way that I saw my team suffer that day. However, what's been interesting after going into news, watching that collapse, going into sports and entertainment, which is kind of on its last legs, and then coming into gaming, a lot of things just feel eerily familiar if you've been through this before. You can look at the headlines from Politico to the headlines at Games Daily Biz. You can see all of these different headlines coming through where time and time again we are seeing layoffs are the solution to cash flow problems. We are going to fix our balance sheet. We are going to make our shareholders happy. We are going to move to our investors by making sure that we are cutting jobs, cutting labor, because labor is expensive. And so the argument that I'm making today is that, we have this whole theory about the invisible hand that controls the markets, and particularly there's a lot that we can talk about in capitalism, free market economy, we can talk about that later. But in the games industry, funding is that invisible hand that is controlling labor. JC had mentioned unions being a powerful form of collective action, and they are. But for those of us who came from, again, journalism or film, where unions are plentiful, and where we have many of them, one of the things you learn is that unions don't fix cash flow. They cannot help in that respect and in that regard. They might be able to negotiate a better severance package, but they can't fix a structural issue like funding. So we're going to talk a little bit about what's going on and what's impacting the labor market, how games are funded, how indie studios are funded, and how even large studios are still at the mercy of this house of cards that is a funding system that we have built. So first there's publishing. I'm not going to go too deeply into that one. Glow Up was never formally published, so it's not something I could speak to. Eka will talk a little bit more in his talk about what happened with Outer Loop. But what was interesting about publishing was understanding, does your game fit into our preferred box? One of the big things that you see is that there's so many ideas, there's so many talented folks who want to create games, but when you're trying to find someone that is going to fund your game, a lot of times you are trying to fit into their vision for what they want. And if your vision is too far outside of that, you might not ever get funding regardless of the quality of your idea. One of my favorite publisher rejections was essentially all green lights. They loved the concept. They loved what they were doing. They agreed that the market that we were serving, we were looking at gamers of color and women in particular, were underserved. They knew this was important. They could see the cultural impact. But their response to us was, we have never tried to speak to this audience. We're not going to be able to help you. We hope it works. So we ended up with venture capital, which is a whole other type of conversation. And in venture capital, the question that they tend to ask the most is, do you fit the pattern? And if you all look at the headlines and look at who is getting funded, one, you'll start to notice it's very winner take all. I believe last year it was, there was a huge drop in the industry, which we'll talk about in a little bit, but there were 572 deals done, representing about $14 billion. But that was poured into 500 studios. It's a very, very small percentage of who's active, who's operating, what's currently happening. The other thing that's very interesting, one of the things to also remember is that they're looking for a profile that they feel like is going to be successful. You'll notice if you look at who has been funded, there's a disproportionate amount of people who have led large game studios. And so back to Shanae's presentation, when you're talking about gender discrimination, when you're talking about people being forced out before they get to mid-level management, before they get to upper-level management, you see that then reflected when we go out to try to get funding and we go out to raise for our studios. If you have not led a large game, if you have not led a large studio, you are seen as a risk. And if the culture doesn't allow for folks like us to come up, right, there becomes that intractable issue. It's very hard to solve it. The other issue is that in the eyes of venture capital, labor is not an asset. Now, if you look at any of the history of video games, if you look at the beautiful team building that JC was talking about, Lisette's, love for the students that she has at Game Heads, which is so obvious every time she talks about it, we invest a lot in our people. We invest a lot in our institutional knowledge. But that's actually a detriment in funding. The more employees you have, the more vulnerable you look. The more funders are going to wonder why you're not using contractors. Why are you trying to offer people benefits? Right? And one of the running jokes I have about founding Glow Up is that starting a for-profit studio in America is going to turn me into a socialist. The amount of questions you get about health insurance, how can you help people, is difficult, especially when you're just a small studio owner trying to make sure you have enough runway to get to the end of the project. But what's interesting is while we fought this out in the indie space and while we fought through all the different hardships and headwinds that come from there, we're seeing the same thing in other avenues as well. So when Volition shut down, I found that to be very interesting. Saints Row is an enormous franchise, well-known, and if you look in the commentary, what happened? Well, a $2 billion deal with the Savvy Games Group fell through, and that took out the studio. Once again, gaming funding is essentially a house of cards where you're jumping from deal to deal, hoping that you can get enough runway to last, get to a hit, or cash back out before you run out of money and opportunity. And for most people, when they play that game, we lose. In addition, we're looking at one of the hardest markets in a long time. If you've noticed, again, I'm sure all of us are looking around thinking about the friends that should be here and didn't make it through the layoffs. The friends that we saw last year, the studios that we saw last year that closed. Some of our investors' studios have closed. And we're looking at friends and mentors trying to weather this huge downturn that just happened. So if games funding dries up, and if we're looking at the ways in which LPs and people who are essentially the larger funders are sitting on capital at the same time where we have millions at this point, which feels like millions, probably tens of thousands, of extremely talented designers, narrative designers, technical artists, things like that, who cannot get jobs because everyone is unsure what is going to happen in the fate of their project from the indies to the majors. We are facing a crisis level, and this crisis is being sparked by funding. So I went and searched to try to explain this a little bit more. And again, I have at least the benefit of working in different industries. So when I looked for, okay, so how are we talking about funding and financing games? This was a chart that was on a blog post. And I looked at this chart and I was like, oh Lord, no, this is not remotely accurate. Number one, there's a spelling error. it was just, I had to fix that real quick. But two, these things are presented as equal options, which they are not, okay? The vast majority of people will never get venture capital funding. Project Diane talks about, particularly for black women entrepreneurs, we got, and this was last year when it was still okay, 0.67% of all venture capital funding. That number is smaller in games. When I look at black women who have raised money, Lisette will be the next, but when I look at black women who have raised money, it's me, it's Jessica from Wicked Saints, it's Kai from Ramen VR. It's not a lot. There are more men from Riot that will ever be able to raise. We used to have this joke at ESPN, there's more men named John on the management team than women, and I feel like we're starting to develop one for funding a game, so we'll get there. But anyway, these sources are not equal, not remotely equal. The vast majority of developers and studios will never get venture funding, and angel funding only goes so far. You're really looking at friends and family, cash flow from other games, crowdfunding, the other ways you cobble together, which again creates that constant cycle of instability where it's really hard to plan to say, yes, I can guarantee you 18 months of wages. Yes, I can guarantee you health insurance. Yes, I can guarantee that I can do these things for you, that I can give you a 401k, that we can contribute to your financial stability as a thank you for what you are contributing to our work in our studio. But contrast that to film, and not to say that film is perfect. We have all kinds of drama on that side as well. But this is just from 1 year of funding that was a data analysis done by a group looking at how films are funded. And the diversity of funding sources that you see on the left allows for a little bit more stability in these projects. So even as I was explaining to other game devs, things about just like finishing funds, a lot of times in game dev, that comes through a publisher who still wants to take 50 to 70% of your game's profits for helping you distribute, even they didn't necessarily put the cash down to help you make it. Versus in film, a lot of times that's just a grant. It's unrestricted, right? Here's the $25,000, $50,000, $100,000 that you will need to finish your documentary. There are different ways that we can look at other types of funding structures. Other countries, particularly like the UK, have different types of funding and investment schemes that allow for more stability and allow for us to have a more predictable and more equitable funding system that will allow for a lot of these things to start being solved once we start asking harder questions about why we have allowed the funding to be so shaky and so focused on winner takes all. So just to conclude, I think one of the big things that we have to remember talking about is that we can always sit and try to improve our interior studio cultures and figure out where we can improve. But until we start looking at the funding landscape and asking hard questions of why is it only certain people that get funded? Why is it that everyone else has to fight for scraps? As we are trying to create cultures that we believe in. Many of us are refugees from studios that burnt us out, that treated us terribly. And yet, when it comes time to fund things and to do things differently, we are starving for the capital that we need. I love the idea of soft power and being able to look at the ways in which we run our studio culture, but soft power still answers to hard money. And we have to figure out a more equitable way of distributing funding in the games industry before we will see this change. So now I'll pass it off to Eka to wrap up what a successful indie studio that is funded by publishers can do.
Hello. Let me adjust this. Okay. Hi, I'm Chandana Kanayaka. I'm the co-founder and creative director of Outer Loop Games. I want to talk about our approach to long-term sustainability as an indie studio and the way we do it, I guess. Before we started Outer Loop, I spent 20 years working in traditional studios, but never felt like it was sustainable. There was a lot of crunching, shifts in direction, chasing trends, restarts, cancel projects, lots of cancel projects. I was always moving to cities that had other game studios just in case I lost my job. I wanted to figure out do I survive another 20 years, because I still like making games, with a better work-life balance and a different approach. While focusing on games about underrepresented themes and stories, and to work with folks in the US and also outside the US. So we started a fully remote studio in 2017 out of necessity. Let's go. We're going to talk about our approaches, what went well and what didn't go so well. We've been in business for 7 years now, and we're starting on our third project. We want to look at how we got there. We'll talk about our 2 shipped games. First one that took 2 years, and the second one that was in development for 3.5. What we learned on each project and about the process, and what we adjusted between projects for longer-term focus. The first game we released was called Falcon Age. It's a first-person action-adventure game about raising a falcon and fighting colonizers. With this project, we saw our culture and values as a way to stand out. Of course, we couldn't start the studio without funding. We didn't have any money. So that was the first step. Myself and my 2 co-founders worked on a pitch and prototype in our spare time while working full-time jobs in a game studio, with the goal idea that we could make a really small and shitty game if we had to with 3 people. Our ambitions were very realistic at that time. We were going to scale the game and idea to fit the team size depending on the funding amount. And we budgeted to pay livable wages with benefits, and that was a must. After 5 months of work, we pitched our 5-minute demo at GDC in 2017 to various publishers and platforms. We were able to get project funding for a 9-person team for 2 years to make the first game happen. Falcon Age was released in 2019, had decent reviews, but we also made a ton of mistakes. After the project, things needed to change. While we did focus on cultural perspective and themes, our process was still lacking in certain areas. Let's talk about what went right and what didn't. We overscoped, as all teams do, even after 20 years of experience. Started a VR game, but also released a non-VR version while also trying to build the studio. I, as a lead, was doing too many jobs: design, art, production, biz dev, lawyers, various admin tasks. We ended up trying to do too much with a team of 9. Our goal was still to have a better work-life balance and do stories about marginalized themes. We need to grow the studio so that our ambitions and goals align better with our capabilities. As Shanae mentioned in her talk, we refocused on hiring for our values and culture. We knew we needed time to figure out our next steps, which meant bringing in more money. We used Falcon Age as a way to expand beyond VR to non-VR platforms. We also took in some work for hire, did some platform deals with Falcon Age, and that money gave us time to figure out what we were going to do to hit our goals and that we set for ourselves. It was important for us to have a mixture of senior, mid-level, and new talent as the team grew to 14. Currently, we're spread across 8 cities and 4 continents. We're spending more time mentoring one-on-ones, using more async work methods and tools like Miro, Slack, and Discord as needed. Sharing knowledge is part of our weekly workflow with show and tells, and as a remote team, communication became so much more crucial to everything we do. Talking to team members, we also do spend a lot of time talking to team members about long-term goals in their current projects and testing out ideas during pitching. So I'll do almost like a play test for pitches when I go out before we actually figure out what we do next as part of our process. So we'll do multiple pitches at DICE and GDC, things like that. And then really we're thinking about how do we stand out as we're growing the team. What we decided to build and prototype was Thirsty Suitors, a game about a queer brown woman coming back to her small town in Washington and having to face her past mistakes, and fighting her exes in a narrative surreal turn-based combat. Cooking with her parents to repair that relationship, and also skating. We started this in March 2020 as the world shut down. It's important for us to keep the team together over multiple projects as long as they want to, of course. We believe the teams that work together over multiple projects make for better games. How do we make sure folks aren't burnt out? Our approach has been more time to rest and also work on interesting projects and problems. We initially switched to a half-day Fridays for several months over the summer, and then that went well, and then we fully switched to a 4-day work week 3 years ago and shipped Thirsty Suitors that way last November. We were realistic about shipping and working with external partners at the end of production. We switched back to 5 days per week for several of us on the project for the last 2 months. Over the last 3 years, we found that folks were more rested and more focused during the week and were able to be more productive. Meaningful individual contribution is an important part of team health on any project. We do monthly one-on-ones to give space to talk about whatever team members want to talk about. The team drives what goes into the game. Anyone on the team can point to something on the game and say, I made that happen. We treat our team members as adults. We set goals and expectations, trust the individuals that will manage their time to hit those goals. If it's not working, we talk through, make adjustments, not just for sort of the labor part of it, but also the design part of it and expectations and timeline. Offer support and change as needed. So how do we stand out as a 14-person indie studio? There are thousands of games released every year. I think it was 14,000 on Steam last year. What makes us different? We ask ourselves what unique perspectives can we bring to our games and balance that with market expectations. Why is this the game the one we should make? We incorporate talent and wants from the folks on the team into the game. We believe specificity of team experience and talent leads to a game an audience can emotionally connect with. We look at genre conventions and expectations in the case of turn-based combat like Thirsty Suitors. It was the theming, humor, the drama, the cultural perspective packaged together in a tighter, visually engaging experience that made it stand out. We assume the current game sells 0 copies. We start to think about our next project before shipping the current one out of necessity, out of need to survive. We start planning and pitching and have the next project lined up. Our approach has been project funding and retaining control of our IP. Again, it's more focused for long term. We work with various platform deals and see what lines up with our needs. We want to pay people well and try to keep our size of game to match the size of team. We're a lifestyle company, like we're not looking to grow and return a 3x or sell the company and not focus on really having some kind of exit. Our goal is can we make another one? Anything beyond that is gravy. We want to control our destiny without too many external cooks in the kitchen. Part of that is working with publishing partners that are aligned with our values and also self-publishing when that makes sense. We ship Thirsty Suitors on all PC and console platforms in November. We took all of December off, started back in January, and talked through as a team what worked in our process and what didn't. I read every comment, watch every review. It's probably not healthy, but that's just the way I work. What worked in the game and what didn't. And we're starting on our next project. We've already seen the benefits of rest and adjustments. We're making more progress already, more than we did in the beginning of the previous project. We're hopeful and understand that we'll keep making adjustments and improvements going forward. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Eka. So let's recap. You heard from Lisette about how we need to commit to training and realistic job requirements. You heard from JC about hard power and soft power, both skills needed to be effective leaders. You heard from me, Shanae, about making and remaking your work culture and thinking more about culture than your wall art. You heard from LaToya about the challenges of game industry funding structures. And lastly, you heard from Eka about running an indie studio where you put people first. Embracing human sustainability is about making better games, but it's also about making games better. We can absolutely do this, leaders. Let's make game development a forever career. Thank you so much for joining us. Come on over to the wrap-up room if you have questions for the speakers. Don't forget to fill out your feedback surveys and have a wonderful rest of your GDC.